Oh my.
What would you do if a towering creature, over 7 feet tall with eyes full of human sorrow, stepped out of the woods? For over 60 years, Merrill Cates lived alone in the Allegheny forest, unshaken by storm or beast, until one autumn night changed everything. A cry unlike any animal he'd ever known echoed through the fog. The next morning he found blood trails, giant footprints, and a steel trap twisted open. Here's the truth few dare to say. Bigfoot is real, and not a monster. It's a family, a wounded mother, a limping child, and a father willing to protect them at any cost. I'm Merrill, a retired forest ranger. I didn't set out to believe, but I saw what no one else wanted to. I cleaned her wounds. I gave them shelter. And when the flood came, that so-called beast held me as I nearly drowned and saved my life. Watch this till the end, and you'll understand why I never told anyone, why silence sometimes is the most human act of all. The coffee was cold, but Merrill Cates still held the old thermos like it mattered. His fingers curled around it the way he used to cradle her hand, firm, worn, but never tight. Outside, the wind moved through the Allegheny pines with a voice of its own, sharp and curling like smoke through the wood stove pipe. Shadows shifted against the log walls, and the only other sound was the slow tick of the battery clock above the window, nearly drowned by the creak of wind pushing against the eaves. Then it came, not a howl, not a deer, not even the low throat grunt of a black bear or the shrill chatter of coyotes on the move. It was something else, something caught between breath and breakage, like a choke half swallowed, like grief that had a throat and tried to scream through it. Merrill froze. Not the kind of stillness that came from curiosity, the kind that wrapped around the bones and told them to shut up and listen. It came again, farther off this time, echoing. Then nothing. Just the trees whispering among themselves, pretending like it hadn't happened at all. He didn't move. He just blinked, slow and dry, the way a man does when his heart is loud in his ears and he's not sure if the quiet is real or just the breath between danger. He reached for the lamp, turned the wick down low. The old floorboard groaned when he stood. His knees weren't what they used to be. Nothing was, but his ears hadn't failed him yet. Not in the 40 years working these woods, and not now. He opened the door just enough to let in the cold. Pine needles rattled on the porch. Fog hung low like breath too heavy to lift, and every step he took into the dark felt like walking backward into a memory he hadn't agreed to revisit. No movement, no eyes watching from the timberline, just the thick scent of rot, wet moss, and the faint iron trace of something he didn't want to name. He stood on the porch for a long time, mug still in hand, cooling against his palm, and for the first time in years, he felt that old tickle in the back of his neck, the one that used to tell him when a mother black bear was watching her cubs near a stream, or when poachers had crossed the state line without care for traps or tags. The feeling that something was off. He slept in the armchair that night, boots on, thermos unopened, rifle leaning by the door but untouched. It wasn't fear. It was something older, something not worth aiming at. Morning came slow and gray, dragging the mist with it like a blanket over the hills. Merrill stepped outside, gravel crunching under his soles, and made his way down the slope behind the cabin, past the sugar maples and the old barn frame where the owls used to nest. There, in the low grass still slick with dew, was a dark smear, dried at the edges, wet in the center. Blood. Not deer, not coyote. Something thicker. He followed it. The trail twisted past the creek bed, over the exposed roots of a wind-thrown beech. Then the ground began to change. Impressions. At first, just dense. Then clearer. 5-toed, heel-heavy, broad enough to fit a hubcap in the arch. Too wide for man, too purposeful for bear. Merrill knelt beside one, pressed his fingers into the edge. The depth told him more than the size. Whatever made it was hurt, and heavy. The drag marks beside the steps told the rest. Something had limped through here, leaning on one side, pulling weight. He kept walking, not because he wanted to, because he needed to know if what he feared was what he hoped. By the time he reached the hemlock stand, the wind had picked up. Tall trunks swayed just enough to groan against each other, like warning murmurs. He stopped near a break in the ground. Moss scraped aside. A scuff of fur caught on the bark, reddish, coarse, and clinging to a splinter like it hadn't wanted to let go. Then silence again. He stood there, just breathing. One hand on the thermos, the other resting on his thigh. That old stand of hemlocks looked the same as it always had. But the air felt different. Charged, like just before a summer storm, when every bird gets quiet, and even the wind waits. Then he saw it. Not far, just past the second rise, half hidden by mist and cedar brush. A shape. Broad, upright, breathing. It didn't run. It didn't growl. It turned, slowly, deliberately. And then, it stepped sideways, blocking something smaller behind it. Not a threat, a shield. Merrill didn't move. He didn't even blink. The steam from his breath met the rising fog like two old ghosts meeting halfway. He thought of Ruth, his wife, the way she used to hum when she stitched quilts by the fire, the way she'd say, "Some things just know love when they see it." He tightened his grip on the thermos and exhaled. Whatever it was, it remembered something. And so did he. The woods had always spoken in signs, broken twigs, a turned leaf, a breath in the wrong place. But that morning, in the hush before the sun broke fully over the ridge, Merrill understood something older than trail maps and game tracks. He wasn't the only one watching, and whatever had left those marks wasn't just surviving. It was trying to protect. The fog thickened again, swallowing the silhouette. Merrill stayed a while longer, just long enough to know it hadn't been his imagination, just long enough to feel the shift, not just in the forest, but in himself. Then he turned back toward the cabin, boots wet, heart louder than it had been in years. He didn't speak a word that day. Didn't tell Gail. Didn't tell May. Didn't write it in the little notebook he kept by the window with the list of strange weather and berry yields. But when he refilled the thermos with fresh coffee that night, he poured 2 cups, left one on the porch rail. Didn't wait to see if it was touched. Didn't have to. And somewhere past the pines, in the deep hush of the Allegheny dusk, a low breath answered the wind. Not a cry, not a growl, something else entirely. A sound like memory, tearing gently at the edge of silence. Not the end, just a beginning waiting to step out of the mist. The trail was fresher now. Merrill could feel it in the way the grass leaned, in the way the damp soil still held the imprint of something too large, too deliberate. Last night's fog hadn't yet lifted fully. It clung to the roots and low branches like it knew what was hidden. The forest was quieter than it should have been at this hour. No bird song, no squirrel chatter, just the creak of old trees settling their weight into the earth and the soft scuff of Merrill's boots along the edge of the gully behind the hemlock stand. He crouched near a shallow dip in the dirt. The leaves were scraped away. Something heavy had passed here recently, and not without effort. He shifted his weight, squinting through the gray, and saw it. Not just one impression, but many. A scuffle, a stumble, and then the unmistakable outline of something thick and furred, dragging itself forward. Nearby, a pine sapling had snapped clean at the midpoint. Its jagged edge darkened with a smear that hadn't yet browned. He followed the scent before he saw it. Metal, rust, the sour sting of blood. It was tangled half under a rock outcrop beside a deadfall. A trap, big, too big for fox or coyote. A thick-jawed steel contraption meant to crush, and it had been crushed in return. One side was twisted open, teeth bent, springs warped like they'd been hit with a crowbar or something stronger. Merrill didn't breathe for a second, just looked. A few coarse strands of hair clung to the jaw, reddish-brown, thicker than bare, matted with something dark. His throat tightened. He ran one gloved hand along the break in the frame. This wasn't damage from rust or time. This was deliberate, forceful, meant to send a message or buy time. Behind him, gravel shifted on the path. A voice, sharp and too familiar. "You always come out here this early?" Merrill didn't turn. "Rufus." Deputy Gale stepped into view, jacket zipped high, cap pulled low. His breath fogged the air, one hand resting near his belt like habit. "Got calls. Old McAllen up near Brush Ridge says something's been tearing up fence lines again. Couple of goats missing. One woman swears she heard a scream like a hog getting gutted." Merrill stood slowly. Predators move through this time of year. Always have. Rufus frowned, eyeing the busted trap. "That the case? Or you covering tracks for someone?" Merrill didn't answer. He lifted the trap with both hands and turned it over once, then set it down again. Rufus crossed his arms. "Town's nervous, Mer. You know that. And nervous folk do dumb things. You see anything strange, you call it in. You understand?" Merrill looked at him then. Really looked. Gale's eyes weren't hostile, just wary, tired. Like he wanted to believe this was all explainable but couldn't quite convince himself. "I'll let you know," Merrill said. The deputy didn't press. He just nodded once, turned on his heel, and crunched back down the trail toward his cruiser. The woods exhaled again. Later that day, Merrill moved through the lowland brush with more urgency. He carried a small hatchet on his belt, not for defense, but for leverage. Trap after trap, some buried shallow under moss, others hidden with pine straw. He found them and disabled them one by one. Some were fresh, too fresh. Unfamiliar boot prints circled a few, wider treads, heavy step patterns, out-of-towners, maybe a hunting party, maybe something worse. He didn't speak as he worked, just the clean sound of spring-loaded metal giving under careful pressure, the occasional snap of resin when he rubbed pine sap across the bent teeth. A warning. Leave. The sun dipped low behind the ridge by the time he finished. On the way back, the forest darkened quicker than usual. Storm clouds moved slow but heavy across the treetops. The air pressed in closer, and that's when he saw it. Near the old CCC stone shelter, half collapsed, a place he rarely visited anymore. A strip of fabric fluttered against the doorway. He paused. It was red and gray checkered, faded, torn at the end. And it was his, not something dropped recently, but a binding cloth he'd used a week ago to cinch gear tight before the first frost rolled in. He remembered tucking it into a pack, but it wasn't in the pack now. It was here, stuck on the edge of the doorway, pulled partway inside. He moved carefully. No rifle in hand. No flashlight. Just the rising throb of wind behind him and that old pit-of-the-stomach knowledge that someone, or something, had been closer than he thought. The stone around the doorway was dark with moisture. The inside black as pitch. No moonlight, no reflection. But there was a smell. Not rot, not animal. Something warm, like wet cedar, crushed fern, iron. He didn't step inside. He just stood at the threshold, boots on the slick stones, fingers brushing the lintel like he was trying to remember who built it, who had come before. The wind caught through the broken window above, pushing a low whistle through the crumbled mortar. It sounded almost like a sigh. He listened, really listened, then turned slowly and walked away. That night the wind shifted. He didn't light the lantern, didn't heat coffee. He just sat in the dark and let the forest speak. The creak of limbs, the low brush of something moving beyond the clearing. Not fast, not panicked. Measured. The thought came unbidden. They're watching. Not in fear, in judgment, testing. And he had a feeling he'd just barely passed. Morning came with no bird song. The traps were gone. Everyone he'd marked with pine sap had been removed. Not tripped, not broken. Just gone. Cleaned. As if the forest itself had decided it was done being baited. He didn't mention it to Rufus. Didn't mention the cloth. But that night he took an old flask of pine resin and traced a simple X on the bark of a maple at the trail's head, then stepped back. Sometimes the only way to speak to what doesn't speak back is through signs. Sometimes the only way to earn trust is to give it first. And as the sun fell again and the forest drew breath in its lungs, Merrill Cates knew this wasn't just about what lived out there. It was about what he was becoming. And somewhere deep inside those woods, something watched and waited and decided he might be worth watching again tomorrow. The rain had been coming down steady since before dawn, not in a rush, but in that cold, needling way that crept under collars and down the back of the neck. The kind of rain that soaked the forest slow and quiet and made the rocks slick with green. Merrill moved carefully through the low slope near the hemlock stand, one hand bracing the medkit against his chest beneath his coat, the other guiding his steps along the familiar trail toward the old CCC shelter. The forest smelled like wet cedar and stone, like damp pine bark and something faint beneath it, something alive but wounded, tucked into the bones of the woods and waiting. He didn't know what he expected to find this time. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. But the rain kept falling, and he kept walking. The stone shelter emerged from the mist like a ruin half swallowed by time. The roof still held on one side, though sagged and bowed by storms past. The other half opened to the gray sky like a wound refusing to close. The darkness inside breathed heavier than the weather. Shadows layered in silence and the kind of stillness that made a man feel watched even before he was. Merrill paused at the edge of the clearing, heart thudding slow but steady, and scanned the trees. Then he saw her. She was there, standing just inside the arch of the broken doorway, where the dim light thinned through mist and the stone caught the sound of rain in shallow echoes. Massive, motionless. She didn't move toward him. She didn't back away either. Her outline was broad and heavy and unmistakable. Thick shoulders bowed under weight, arms long and angled down like she carried gravity in her bones. Her fur, wet and darkened by the rain, clung in heavy strands across her body. Her breath was visible in the cold, low and steady, rising from the dark like heat from a chimney. Merrill didn't speak. He didn't reach. He simply stepped forward and knelt halfway between them in the mud, then placed the small kit carefully at the edge of the dry threshold. He kept his head low, his hands open and resting on his thighs. His voice remained in his chest. This wasn't a moment for noise. It was one for stillness. He eased back, one step, then another, and settled on the old rock ledge that faced the entrance. He waited. Rain dripped from the brim of his hat and soaked the back of his collar. The shadows inside shifted, and then, from behind the larger form, a smaller figure limped forward into the faint light. Narrower, shorter, but unmistakably of the same kind. The younger one moved unevenly, its gait favoring the left leg, one arm cradled tight against its chest. Its eyes, deep-set and glassy in the rainlight, flicked from Merrill to the box, then back. Curious, hesitant, tired. Then something changed. A pressure in the air. A presence behind him. Merrill didn't turn right away. His fingers tightened slightly on his thigh, breath shallow but not panicked. The ground trembled faintly as something approached, massive but silent until it chose not to be. A single footstep, then another. Then he turned his head, slow, deliberate. The patriarch stood just beyond the clearing, taller than the doorway itself, thick like a split tree. His chest rose and fell like a furnace. Water streamed down the broad slope of his shoulders. His arms hung still, but the message was clear. You do not leave yet. Merrill didn't move. His eyes met the creature's, and he understood. This wasn't a threat. This was a test, a gate. The choice to stay was not his alone. And then, after a pause that stretched the length of thunder without sound, the great figure stepped aside. Not far, just enough. A signal. Inside, the matriarch shifted. Her weight leaned forward, then toward the rock pillar inside the shelter. She lowered herself, slow, deliberate, until her shoulder pressed against the edge of the stone wall. The wound was visible now, dark along the flank, crusted with dried blood, edges inflamed from days without cleansing. She angled her body just enough to expose the side. Merrill understood. He rose carefully, unfastened his coat, and stepped inside. The air was warmer somehow within the stone, or maybe it was the breath of the creatures, slow and damp, thick with something older than language. He reached for the kit, unlatched it, pulled free the small bottle of iodine, the folded cloth, the bandage. She didn't flinch as he approached, only watched. He worked slowly, gently dabbing the wound, cleaning away the dirt and crusted fur, letting the rainlight illuminate what infection had begun to bloom. She breathed heavier when the antiseptic hit raw skin. A low sound slipped from her chest, but not a growl. More like pain wrapped in pride. He didn't speak. He just worked, one layer at a time. The juvenile stood nearby, watching everything. Not scared, just silent. When Merrill was done, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in waxed cloth. Inside, folded with care, was an old cotton hat, his wife's. He stared at it a moment, then stepped to the far wall and hung it on a crooked bit of stone that jutted like a hook. He didn't explain the gesture, didn't try to make it mean anything more than what it was. He stepped back out into the rain and sat once more on the ledge, his knees soaked, his hands muddy. The sound of rain on stone echoed like a drum, quiet and close. The forest around them breathed deep. Behind him, the patriarch remained still as a statue. He hadn't moved. Merrill didn't need him to. That night, back at the cabin, he sat by the window and watched the line where trees met sky. He didn't light the lamp. He didn't need to write it down. The silence told enough. He had touched something sacred that day. And he knew, beyond all doubt, that the moment had passed from trial to trust. But trust, he also knew, was not a guarantee. It was a living thing. It could be broken. It could be earned again. But never faked. The fire crackled low in the hearth. Outside, the rain didn't stop. And deep in the woods, beyond the hemlock stand, beyond the line of what was known, something exhaled. Not close, but not far either. And Merrill understood the message in that breath. Come again. Come gentle. Come with hands that mean no harm. He closed his eyes and let the sound of water on the rooftop fill the room. The cotton hat still hung in the shelter. Maybe tomorrow it would still be there. Or maybe it'd be moved. Kept. Remembered. Either way, he'd return, under the pale sky that never quite shook the weight of winter. The woods began whispering louder. Not in words, in signs. In the hush of movement where there should have been stillness. In the tension of animals gone quiet. In the way water pooled longer than it should in the ruts of the northern trail. Merrill noticed it first through talk, not trees. It was the way faces looked sideways when they thought no one was watching. How the girl at the feed store handed him his change without meeting his eyes. Something had spread in town like rot under the floorboards. Whispers about the forest, about noises in the night, about something that wasn't right with the pigs. They said one had been taken clean out of the pen. No noise, no broken boards, just the back gate swinging and hoof marks gone soft in the dirt. Old Jeb from the far end of Tia Nesta said he saw a shape tall as the door frame standing at the edge of his barn at first light. Swore it sniffed the air and didn't move when he raised his shotgun. Said he didn't shoot 'cause it didn't feel right, didn't feel animal. By the end of the week, Deputy Gale had called for a patrol. He didn't like being questioned. He liked being ignored even less. So they gathered. 4 men with flashlights and big talk and rifles too clean to know better. Merrill heard about it from May Davenport that morning, right before she placed a small bag of cornmeal and lavender salve on his porch with her quiet, knowing eyes and lips that stayed shut like she'd already said everything that mattered. He didn't ask. She didn't explain. But when the screen door creaked and she turned to leave, She paused just long enough for him to know she understood more than she let on. He left before noon. Hemlock Stand held its breath as he moved through. The path had changed again. More traps, different placement. The spacing wasn't careless. They weren't from Gale's boys. These were further out, deeper in, hidden better. And there were other signs. Twine pressed into bark, cigarette ash near a tree root, boot prints that didn't match anything from town. Longer stride, wider heel. Outsiders. He knelt beside a print, still sharp around the edges, the heel dug deep. Someone was here last night, someone looking for more than game. He followed the boot prints east, tracing the edges of a narrow draw that fed into a dry creek bed. Something caught the light ahead. Brass casing, fresh. He picked it up with 2 fingers and turned it in the overcast glow. A 3-weight. Not for birds. The forest around him grew tighter. Hemlocks closed in, shoulders of bark pressing down from above. Every sound felt louder. His own breath, the snap of a twig, the creak of a branch rubbed raw by the wind. But it wasn't the trees that made him stop. It was the feeling. That same pressure, like lungs too full. He stood still. Not far off, deeper into the thick light. A beam, narrow and jittering, cut across the trunks in the distance. Not steady like a patrol, not sweeping like someone trying to get home. It bounced, sharp and purposeful. Not Gale, and not him. Merrill dropped low, stepping carefully, keeping the moss underfoot where he could. He followed it just long enough to know. 3 flashlights, not locals, no coats from Tionesta Feed or ball caps from Jenkins Hardware. These were men with gear too new, boots too clean. And guns. Big ones. He didn't linger. By the time he turned back toward his cabin, dusk had started to fall. The clouds had thickened again. The wind had that thin edge that came before stormlight. The trail up the ridge pulled him near the shelter again. He didn't plan to go there, but his boots had other thoughts. And there, under the boughs just before the clearing, he saw it. A single strip of cloth, fluttering slow in the breeze, pinned against the stones of the shelter wall. Not his. It was the same color as the one he'd left behind. But this was different. Smaller, wetter, and it had been pulled inside, not by wind, by hand. He stepped to the doorway, slower this time. The rain hadn't come yet, but it was close. The air tasted like it, and from inside the dark, the stone breathed again. He didn't speak, didn't step in. The silence there was thicker than last time. It didn't press against him, it pulled. A shifting sound moved just beyond the edge of light. He waited, but nothing came forward, only the breeze through the broken roof, catching the opening like a throat, and sending a soft, low whistle that stirred something in his chest. He stepped back, the cloth still in his hand. As he turned, he caught movement out of the corner of his eye. To the west, just past the trail bend, a woman's figure in a red coat, walking carefully across the edge of his clearing. May. She didn't come to the door, didn't call out. She just placed something near the post, another canvas bag, and left the same way she came, head low, steps sure. Merrill stepped to where she'd been. Inside the bag, wrapped in old newspaper, were 2 glass jars, one of honey, one of pine tar balm. No note, but none was needed. He looked out across the trees. The wind was shifting again, and something was coming. Not just storm, not just men with too much confidence and too little history. Something heavier. The forest was tightening its grip, and the space for silence was shrinking. He poured water on the stovetop kettle, set it down without lighting the flame, and stood at the window with both hands braced on the frame. May's bag sat unopened beside the table, and his breath, visible against the glass, fogged the edge of his own reflection until all that remained was a silhouette, gray and older than he remembered. He didn't feel fear, not yet, but what he felt was close to it. The kind of weight that comes before something tears open, the line between what people think they know and what they don't want to believe. He stepped away from the window, reached for the kettle, then thought better of it. Instead, he opened the old drawer beneath the stairs, the one where he kept things that hadn't seen light in years. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was the map, the one with marks from decades past, old trails, fire scars, trap sites. He opened it on the table, marked the hemlock stand again, then circled 3 new spots. Not for himself, not yet, but in case someone else needed to know. The air shifted again, and somewhere far off, the woods answered. A sound low and long, and not like any coyote, not like anything with fur and fangs, like breath drawn through teeth, like warning, like promise. And Merrill sat down slow, one hand still on the cloth from the shelter, still damp, still warm, and in that moment, he understood. Whatever waited out there wasn't just trying to hide anymore. It was beginning to protect, and that meant others would come looking to destroy. The storm would not be just wind and rain. It would come with rifles, and something would have to stand between the two. The kettle never boiled, and Merrill never moved again that night from the chair near the door. He just listened to the slow knock of the wind against the siding, to the breathing woods, and to the certainty in his own chest that the quiet days were ending. And someone else was finally beginning to notice. The fog hadn't lifted. It pressed low and heavy along the ridge lines, soaking into the bark and the bones beneath it. The kind of fog that didn't just hide things but felt like it knew what it was hiding. The morning dragged its feet. Pale, colorless light filtered through the canopy, and nothing moved but the hush of damp air and the occasional slow creak of branches. Merrill walked with his collar up, boots sinking into the soft soil along the edge of the river stones. Hemlock stand lay behind him, but the weight of it hadn't let go. He'd been tracking the new prints for 2 days. Fresh disturbances along the creek beds, saplings broken not by wind, but by hands. And this morning, something had shifted. He found scat, dry and recent. Bark rubbed clean on a white oak. Then a print, half obscured but unmistakable. Broad, wide-toed, and slightly dragging. Juvenile. And nearby, a smaller scrape in the shale, like someone, or something, had tried to crouch there but lost balance. Merrill moved faster now, staying low, keeping his weight off the loose rock. Then he saw it. Down by the creek's edge, just past the bend, something dark hunched near the boulders. One leg twisted under, thin arms trying to pull free. Juvenile. The young one was caught. A fallen limb from one of the old black pines had collapsed across the lower leg, pinning it. The creature wasn't making sound. Not a scream, not even a whimper. Just breath, rapid and shallow. Its eyes were wide, white ringed with red, and filled with something between panic and pain. Merrill stepped forward, slow but deliberate, and raised his hand. He didn't speak. Just enough movement to be seen, not feared. And then, a crack of leaves and bootsteps from uphill. Too close. Merrill turned his head sharply. Deputy Gale, rifle slung low, breath visible in the cold. Eyes already scanning the creek bed. He was close. Too close. Merrill moved. He stepped sideways on purpose, crunching a branch underfoot, loud enough to draw attention. Gale's head snapped toward the sound. Merrill raised a hand like he was shielding his eyes. "Morning," he said, his voice low, calm, measured. "Didn't expect you out this way." Gale looked at him, confused at first, then wary. He stepped closer, eyes flicking past Merrill toward the creek bed. "What are you doing down here, Mer?" "Looking for traps," Merrill replied, tapping the handle of the tool hanging from his belt. "Found a few more. Thought I'd beat the snow." Gale's eyes narrowed. "This far out?" "You said it yourself. Signs are spreading. I thought I'd clear the outer trails." The air was too still. The sound of water against stone kept up its slow murmur. But beneath it, Merrill could hear the shift of small limbs behind him, trying not to move. "Someone setting more?" Gale asked. Merrill nodded. "And bigger. Not your usual poachers. Got a bad feeling about it." There was a long silence. Then Gale looked toward the stones again, his expression tight. "You hiding something?" Merrill didn't answer, just watched him, then slowly pointed downhill. "Not what you think. But there's something out here worth keeping safe." Gale's hand drifted toward the strap of his rifle. "Mer," he said, voice lower now. "You can't protect everything, not from what's coming." "I'm not trying to protect everything," Merrill said. "Just what matters." Behind them, to the left of the slope, something moved. A low groan, deep like the belly of the earth shifting. Then a crash. A dead tree, half-rotted and moss-choked, tipped sideways into the path. It landed with a thud so loud the ground trembled. Not random, deliberate. It blocked the trail entirely, between Gale and the tree line. Both men turned. Standing above the ridge was the patriarch, still, immense. His form backlit by fog and filtered light, barely visible but undeniable. He didn't roar, didn't charge. He just stood, one hand resting on another tree, his shoulders hunched slightly forward, like someone watching something fragile and dangerous at once. Gale stepped back, his mouth open. Merrill didn't move. The big one held his ground a moment longer, then turned, disappearing into the thick. Not running, not fleeing, leaving a message. "Not today." "Not yours. Not yet." Gale exhaled, long and slow, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I didn't see a thing." He turned back toward Merrill, eyes different now. Not afraid, not quite, but changed. Merrill nodded once. "You sure?" "I'm sure," Gale said. Then after a long pause, "But I saw the tree fall, and I saw who pushed it." Merrill said nothing. The silence said enough. Gale looked once more toward the blocked path, then walked away. Not fast, not slow, just deliberate, like a man rethinking the world under his boots. Merrill waited until the deputy's figure vanished into the trees, then turned back toward the creek. The juvenile was still there, eyes wide, chest rising fast, but still watching. Trust uncertain. Merrill approached, crouched low beside the fallen pine, braced both hands against the thick limb. He pushed, slow, nothing. Then again, and again, muscles burning, boots slipping in the mud. Then, from behind, warmth, mass. A huge hand gripped the far side. The patriarch again, silently returned. Together they lifted. The log shifted, rolled, fell to the side with a groan. The juvenile pulled free, scrambling back, testing its leg. Not broken, just bruised. It stood slowly, limping toward the shelter of the pines. Merrill exhaled, falling back to sit in the mud, breathing hard. The patriarch stood over him for one long moment, then turned. Disappeared again. Not a sound, not a branch broken. Merrill sat there, mud clinging to his jacket, his heart full of too much to say aloud. He looked to the trees, then the creek, then the place where Gale had stood. 3 paths, 3 truths, and somehow they were all converging. Not cleanly, not safely, but closer now, like water pushing against a dam that couldn't hold much longer. The next step wasn't his alone, but it would cost him something, and he already felt the edge of it, pressing like cold metal just beneath the skin. He stood, knees stiff, back sore, and walked back toward the shelter, eyes scanning the branches. The hat was still there. Dry now, left untouched, but no longer just a gift. It had become a pact. The forest didn't speak in words, but it never lied, and that day, Merrill knew. He hadn't just seen compassion. He'd been measured, and, for now, spared. But nothing stays spared forever, especially not in Allegheny, especially not when the wind shifts this way. The temperature dropped fast that afternoon, the kind of sharp shift that made the back of Merrill's neck tighten before he even felt the wind. The storm hadn't arrived yet, but it was coming. You could feel it in the stillness of the woods, in the way the squirrels disappeared early, and even the birds had gone silent, like they knew the trees would soon be swaying for something other than wind. A brittle edge hung in the air, like something about to break, and not just in the weather. He moved through the timber in a slow, practiced rhythm, carrying the canvas sack over one shoulder, one boot step at a time. Inside were strips of flannel, gauze, 2 tin water flasks, iodine, an old lantern, and a battered fleece jacket he'd once worn every morning in November when Ruth was still alive. The weight of it on his back wasn't much, but the meaning of what he carried felt heavier than anything he'd brought into these woods before. The trail narrowed near the ridgeline, half covered now in blown pine needles and mud slick from melted frost. He paused before the stone shelter. The moss-covered roof bowed under its own memory, and the dark opening yawned like a throat, waiting to swallow what little warmth he still carried. He didn't knock. There was no need anymore. Inside, the light was thin and gray. Matriarch lay curled on her side, her great shoulder hunched inward, breathing uneven and shallow. Her fur, once thick and lustered even in the cold, now clumped near the wound. The infection had spread. He could smell it, a sour note beneath the scent of wet rock and earth. Juvenile sat a few paces behind her, back pressed to the wall, legs pulled in, silent but alert. She didn't move when Merrill entered. Not a flinch, not even an eye opened. But he knew she was aware. Every muscle in that massive frame trembled faintly, like the body was trying to hold the line while the fever dragged her deeper. He set down the sack, unrolled the supplies slowly. No sudden moves, no sound that didn't need to exist. Then, with both hands open, he approached the matriarch. "I'm not here to hurt you," he whispered. Not because he thought she understood the words, but because saying it made his hands gentler. The wound had swollen since he last cleaned it. The edge of the thigh was tender, skin taut beneath the thick fur, red seeping toward purple. He soaked the cloth with clean water first. Not cold, not warm, just enough to pull back the sweat and the dirt. She stirred once, a low vibration in her chest, not pain exactly, but not comfort either. He dabbed, then cleaned, then dabbed again. Then came the part he dreaded. He uncapped the iodine bottle. It stung the air before it touched her skin. As soon as it did, her whole leg tensed. Her breath came faster. Her lips pulled back in what might have been a snarl, but didn't finish. He didn't flinch. He just kept working. Careful, honest, present, he whispered the whole time. Nothing coherent, just fragments of comfort. "You're okay. You're safe. It's gonna pass." The sound of the wind outside deepened. The trees above groaned. Then, without warning, she shifted. Not away, toward. Not to strike, but to rest. Her arm, massive and trembling, slid against the stone as if seeking something solid. She leaned slightly in his direction, pressing her fever-warm side closer to where he knelt. Not to be touched, just to feel something near. Merrill stopped moving, felt the weight of what she allowed, then slowly removed his jacket. He didn't place it over her. That would have been intrusion. Instead, he set it down beside her, close enough to share the heat, far enough to let her choose. She didn't pull it, but she didn't push it away. The juvenile hadn't moved, still watching, still learning. Merrill turned back to the bag, pulled out the last strip of cloth and bound the wound gently, tying it off behind the leg. Not tight, just secure. He glanced once more at her eyes, still shut, but breathing steadier now. Then he stood, walked toward the entrance of the shelter, stood in the doorway, and listened. The wind had picked up. The forest hissed, and from deep in the timberline came a sound he'd been expecting. A rifle crack. Far, but not far enough. Then another, and another. He reached into the sack, pulled out the old field glasses, scanned the tree line through the shifting mist. Northwest slope, maybe a mile off. Too close. They were hunting. Not deer. He knew it. They knew it. This wasn't about food. It was about proof, trophies, dominance. He stepped back inside, gathered the cloth scraps and the empty bottles, cleaned the area, kept the jacket in place, then paused, looked to the juvenile. The small one didn't blink, but something in its eyes had softened, just enough. He nodded once, then laughed. Outside, the clouds thickened. The first flake fell, then another, then hundreds. The world dulled beneath white, but not silent, because the sound of men moved beneath the trees. And snow wouldn't bury what was coming. Not now. He returned home by dusk, soaked to the bone, skin raw with cold. May had been by. He saw the box on the steps, an old metal stove pan inside with 2 cans of soup, a strip of kindling wrapped in twine, and a single small bottle of homemade fire gel. No note. No need. He brought it inside. lit the lamp, sat by the stove and watched the flame move, and thought of the sound the matriarch made when he touched her skin. Not pain, not rage, not defeat. Something older, like trust trying to remember how to be born. The wind howled outside, knocking once, twice, against the window pane, then quieted, then rose again. He reached across the table, pulled Ruth's old quilt over his lap, and held his breath as the storm truly began. Not just snow, but what followed it, what walked behind the sound of falling sky. And somewhere, in the stone cradle of the mountain, a wounded guardian shivered, not in weakness, but in warning. And Merrill knew tomorrow would not come easy, not for him, not for the forest, and not for what still believed there might be something left worth saving. The rain had turned violent overnight, not steady like before, but wild, slamming against rooftops, sweeping low through the timber like something trying to tear the skin off the land. The sound of it on the metal flashing outside Merrill's cabin was constant, a drumming that left no silence to rest inside. He hadn't slept, just sat by the stove most of the night, listening for the one sound he feared more than gunfire. Wood splitting in the wrong rhythm, boots where boots didn't belong, something screaming that shouldn't have known how. By first light, the creeks had risen. The water ran high and fast across the lowlands. Tree limbs floated like corpses, and he knew if Juvenile couldn't run, couldn't climb, the storm might finish what bullets hadn't. He packed quick: rope, blanket, lantern, a short pry bar, 2 thermoses, no rifle. That choice had been made long ago. He pulled on his coat, locked the cabin, and stepped into the floodlight gray of the storm. Tionesta Creek was no longer a line in the land. It was a voice, and it was screaming. He fought uphill, past the place where the last trap had been pulled, boots slipping on moss and stone. By the time he reached the ridgeline near the shelter, the sky was already choking out the trees with fog and rain. Everything smelled like panic. But there, just past the slope, he saw movement, a flash of dark fur against the pale water. Juvenile. It was in the creek, midstream, pinned. A split trunk had come down with the current and rolled atop the young one's leg, holding it halfway submerged, just enough to keep its chest above water. But not for long. Merrill moved before thinking, slid down the bank, splashed knee-deep into the freezing current. The roar of the water drowned out breath, drowned out thought. He grabbed the tree limb, pushed, strained, nothing. It wouldn't budge. He braced a foot against a rock, tried again, still no movement. He glanced at the creature's face, eyes wide, blinking against the spray. One arm stretched out like it still wanted to believe help was real. Then, behind him, a shadow, the weight of something more than just water. A hand, massive, slid around his midsection, pulled. He turned his head, and there he was, Patriarch, soaked, unflinching, silent. The big one pressed in, shoulder to the log, legs set wide. Merrill braced again. Together, they heaved. The wood groaned, lifted. Juvenile slid free, tumbling sideways into the rocks. Merrill reached out, caught its arm, pulled it upright. Breathing, shaking, alive. Then, a noise. From the bank. Boots, metal on stone. A shout, a crash. One of the hunters, slipping on the wet slope, tumbling down, rifle skittering from his grip. He hit hard. Didn't move. Patriarch turned, faced him. Merrill's breath caught. It was about to happen. But then, Matriarch, from behind the tree line, still limping, still wrapped in the coat he'd left behind. She came fast, faster than a wound should allow, moved past Patriarch, past Merrill, to the man on the rocks, and didn't strike, didn't roar. She leaned in, put one arm beneath the man's back, lifted. His eyes opened. He gasped, looked up into the face of the very thing he came to kill, and saw no rage, just mercy. She set him down, backed away. Rain soaked her fur. Steam rose off the heat of her skin, and for one breathless second, the storm paused. The trees stopped moving. The river stopped rising. Merrill stood beside Juvenile, watching the world tilt into something almost sacred. Then, Deputy Gale, from the ridge. He saw everything. His boots planted, his hand at his side. No weapon raised, no word spoken. He didn't need to speak, because something had shifted, and no law written in town could hold what they'd just witnessed. Merrill stepped up the bank. Juvenile followed, limping. Patriarch held back, just beyond the line of sight. Matriarch moved slower now, but upright, and they all, man, beast, witness, gathered beneath the old overhang, where stone met earth. Rain fell in sheets, pounding the river flat, blinding the ridgeline. But under that ledge, nothing stirred. Just breath, and warmth, and the sound of fear retreating. No one spoke. Not Merrill, not Gale, not even the hunter, who now sat up, cradling his side like the truth had bruised him deeper than the fall. Time passed. Merrill didn't count it. Neither did the forest. But when the rain softened, just barely, he stood, looked at Gale. Their eyes met. No smile, no nod. Just the kind of look two men share when the rules no longer hold and something else, something older, has stepped in. Gale stepped out first, back into the storm, never looked back. Merrill waited until the others were gone. The creatures, the man, only the water remained, and the silence. He sat down on a rock, took off his hat, let the rain find him. And for the first time in months he didn't feel alone, not because someone sat beside him, but because something deeper now lived between them. A thread, a bond, forged in water and chosen in mercy. And though the storm hadn't ended, it no longer felt like an ending. It felt like something just beginning. And he knew, whatever came next, he would not be the same man who heard the first scream in the fog. He would not walk away unchanged, and neither would the ones who once lived only in stories. The forest remembered, and so did he. But some truths didn't need retelling. Some truths just had to be carried, and he would carry this one, until the last fire faded, and the trees stopped whispering. By morning, the storm had passed. What was left behind wasn't quiet, not exactly, but something close, an exhausted stillness, like the woods themselves had been wrung out and left to steam in the pale wash of sunlight that broke unevenly through the bare canopy. The river had pulled back, but only just. Everything along the banks was battered. Broken limbs, mud-caked roots, silt streaks on tree trunks showing how high the water had come. Merrill walked the edge of the clearing without sound, boots squelching through the softened trail, coat still damp from the night before. He didn't speak, not to himself, not to the wind, because there was nothing left to say, only something left to see. He followed the trail to the hemlock stand one last time. The pine needles, usually soft underfoot, were torn and ragged, scattered in all directions. Patches of snow clung to the shaded side of trunks, thin as breath. In the distance, not far from where the creek bent and vanished behind a low ridge, he found them. Footprints, big, deeper than his own, but no longer random. They moved in a clear line, out of the shelter, across the open field, through the frost-heavy grass, and into the deeper woods where light turned to shadow and human memory didn't go. Not scattered, not desperate. They had left with purpose, together. A family, moving on. He stood there a long time, eyes fixed on the last set of prints before the brush swallowed them. Then knelt, one hand pressed gently to the muddy ground. The prints weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. He could still smell the heat in the air, still feel the weight of presence that lingered after something sacred had passed through. They were gone, but not lost. Not this time. He rose, pulled his scarf tighter against the wind, and turned back toward the ridge. By the time he returned to the cabin, the morning had grown brighter, sky turning the color of cold bone. There was a truck parked near the gate. County marked, engine ticking, dust from the road still clinging to the rear bumper. Deputy Gale stood leaning against the hood, arms crossed, eyes scanning the tree line like he wasn't sure whether to knock or just wait and listen. Merrill nodded once as he approached. "You're early." Gale didn't answer right away, then said, "It's done." "Done?" "The hunt," Gale said. "Over. No more permits, no more patrols. Anyone caught out there now with a gun and a trap gets fined, and if I feel like it, charged." He paused, then added, "The out-of-town boys left before dawn, didn't even pack half their gear." Merrill's breath came easier. He didn't show it, but Gale saw it anyway. "I filed it under illegal baiting and damage to protected land," Gale said. Didn't say a word about what we saw. Didn't need to. Silence again. Then Gale reached into the cab of his truck and pulled out a paper sack. Set it on the porch. "May sent biscuits. And that blackberry jam you like?" Merrill smiled, barely, but it reached his eyes. "Tell her I said thanks." Gale nodded once, then turned to go. Stopped halfway back to the driver's side. Looked over his shoulder. "Whatever you think that was out there," he said, voice low, "I think you're right to protect it. Whatever it was, it chose kindness when it didn't have to." Then he was gone. Tires crunching gravel. Truck vanishing down the tree-lined road like it had never been there. Merrill stood on the porch a while longer. Watched the wind move through the dry oak branches. Watched a single crow glide overhead, circle once, then disappear over the ridgeline. He turned inside, sat by the window, poured himself coffee, then noticed something on the mantel. A shape. Familiar. He stood, crossed the room, and stared. It was the old cotton hat, his wife's, the one he'd left in the shelter. It was dry, clean, folded carefully and set on the wood like it had always belonged there. But he hadn't brought it home. He would have remembered that. His hands trembled slightly as he picked it up. There was no note, no sign, just the fabric and the silence, and a knowing that sat in the room like breath. He looked out the window again, toward the woods, toward the place where lines had once been drawn and had now been quietly, irrevocably erased. And his heart, for the first time in many long years, felt less like something he had to protect, and more like something that might still have purpose. That afternoon, he walked alone down to the edge of the creek. The ground was slick with moss, the water higher than normal, the air full of that after-storm smell. Wet earth, cedar, the faint tang of pine sap. He sat on the same rock he always sat on, placed the hat beside him, let his fingers rest in the soft green moss growing between the cracks. He didn't cry, didn't speak. He just sat and remembered. Not the danger, not the fear, but the touch, the breath. The moment when something wild had become something more. The river rushed past him, soft and steady. Above, the sky cleared a little more. A shaft of light broke through the thinning clouds and landed on the opposite bank, catching in the wet bark of the trees, turning the world silver for just a moment. He sat there until the light shifted, then rose, and walked back toward the cabin. His coat hung heavier on his shoulders, but not with weight, with meaning. Back home, he didn't write anything down, didn't reach for a camera, didn't lock the door. He didn't need to, because some truths didn't belong in notebooks. They belonged in the heart, in quiet gestures, in things given and returned without ever being asked. That night, he sat by the stove, quilt over his lap, and let the wind move through the eaves like it was welcome. Not a warning, not a threat, just part of the world again. He thought of the hat, of the silence in the shelter, of the child pressed against his coat, of the storm, of the mercy, and somewhere far beyond the timberline, he imagined them walking still, together, upright, unseen, but not forgotten, not anymore. And when the wind knocked once on the door, then twice, he didn't flinch. He just smiled and whispered, "I know," then let it pass. And the fire, gentle as breath, kept burning. Sometimes, the deepest truths don't come with answers, but with presence. A look held a moment longer. A quiet choice not to harm. A breath shared between two beings who should have feared each other but didn't. Somewhere between the violence we inherit and the silence we grow into, there's still space for compassion, for the kind that doesn't need proof to be real. This story was never about proving what exists, but about remembering what matters when all the noise falls away. There are places in this world, forgotten, overgrown, carved into the earth by time, where something still waits to be seen, not with eyes, but with heart. And if you're quiet enough, if you listen with more than just ears, you'll feel it. The weight of mercy, the grace of restraint, the way even the fiercest storms can leave behind something soft. Sometimes what saves us isn't strength, but tenderness, not dominance, but dignity. And when we choose to see the unfamiliar not as threat, but as reflection, when we meet the wild with humility instead of conquest, what's left behind isn't just survival, it's something sacred. Because in the end, the most powerful thing we can do is choose kindness when no one's watching. Thank you for staying with this story until the very last word. If it moved something in you, if it reminded you of something you'd nearly forgotten, leave us a thought in the comments. We'd love to hear what you felt, what you saw between the lines. And if you believe in stories that carry more than just sound, stories that hold silence, healing, and the slow return of trust, consider subscribing. There's more to come. Some stories walk deeper into the woods, and some come back with you. We'll see you in the next one.